Last time on the Infinite Inning. You're looking for the skip recap button, but that won't be necessary. All I wanted to remind you of is that last episode, I mentioned the knuckleball pitcher Gene Bearden, surprise star, of the 1948 Cleveland Indians team, which had a lot of surprise stars given that, among other things, the manager, the shortstop, one and the same, Lou Boudreau, had what is still one of the best seasons by a major league shortstop, hitting .355 with 18 home runs, 106 RBIs, 98 walks, only 9 Ks, good defense. But more importantly, for both baseball and the nation, that team had both Larry Doby playing at a high level in center field, and it had Satchel Paige in the major leagues for the first time. And although he was in his 40s, he was still terrific, working in a swing role. A few years later, when he was working as a pseudo closer for the Browns, Casey Stengel would turn to the dugout if the team was trailing and say, hurry up, Father Time is coming. And I love that hat tip, that gesture of respect. It wasn't simply that Page was old, it was that he was old and effective. Umpire Bill Clem was old, and Casey made fun of Bill Clem. He said he doesn't see so good anymore. He umpires by hearing if it sounds like a strike. You can imagine the rest. No one saw Bearden coming, and maybe he was the essential ingredient because all these years later, we're still waiting on a sequel to that team. I fear they're going to have to de-age some of those stars like Disney tried to do with Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones and the Digital Watch of the Crystal Cavern of Doom, or whatever that last one was called. Raiders of the Lost Ark might be my favorite movie of all time on a lot of levels, and yet I still couldn't finish that one. What I'm trying to say is that they're going to have to recast some parts. They've already brought Carrie Fisher back once. Hey, it's Star Wars. It's about futuristic technology enabling necrophiliac encounters, isn't it? Well, yeah, totally. But for the bad guys, maybe you missed that part. I'm sorry, folks. I'm a little punchy tonight. I'll explain later. I still want to tell Bearden's story. And would you believe Casey figures in there too? He helped get Bearden to the major leagues via Oakland. But for now, I just want to give you this little bit that isn't so much about Bearden himself, but about the changing of the seasons, which I mean as a metaphor for the way a hero can be the glory of his or her times, but perhaps not of any other. People move on and forget. This week, I watched the Netflix miniseries Death by Lightning. It's about the assassination of President James Garfield by the mentally disturbed Charles Guiteau, often described as a disgruntled office seeker, which he was, except that he had no more right to expect some sort of patronage position from Garfield or the Republicans in charge than I do to expect the Mets will make me their new first baseman if Pete Alonso leaves in free agency. He was just completely delusional, as I would be. And who's to say I'm not, for reasons all of my own, but that would be a different podcast from today's episode anyway. I quite enjoyed the show, which was broadly accurate given the usual standards of historical dramatizations, particularly one that's limited to 4 concise episodes. I especially enjoyed Matthew McFadden as Guiteau and Nick Offerman in kind of a big, fun performance as Chester Arthur. I flatter myself to think that I got more out of it than the average bear just because this is stuff that I studied. I've studied it on my own. I studied it in school. And whereas I'm by no means an expert on the period of American history and politics that spans from the end of the Civil War to, say, the beginning of the Progressive Era, I do know my stalwarts from my half-breeds. And for those who did not go to that class, well, first of all, congratulations. You probably shouldn't have. And second of all, those were Republican Party factions of the moment that Garfield's election took place. The show doesn't ask you to know those labels at all, and in terms of the conflict between them, which I'm going to get to in half a second, I won't dwell on it for long. We're getting to baseball, I promise. They explain that conflict multiple times in each episode, not only so you understand what was at stake for the country, what was at stake or is at stake within the show for the characters, but also to underscore its relevance to the present day. And it is. Yes, it was a long time ago, but what the characters on that show are arguing about is how much corruption should be baked into politics. America had slipped into fee-for-service government, where a civil servant could get pretty wealthy just by getting his palm greased for every single thing his job required him to do. Sometimes the government would actually give that person a tip for whatever it was, whatever task they were assigned to do. More often, it was the citizen who needed the service who would provide that extra incentive. There was no FBI back then, but imagine if you were in the unfortunate position of having to say, Director Hoover, John Dillinger has kidnapped my mom. Well, we'll look into that. I know you'll make it worth our while to do so. And that money received by those civil, again, servants, I'm trying to say the quotation marks, servants, some of it stayed with the person who first received it, and some of it got kicked up the ladder, and it funded the bosses who ran the parties. So the bosses liked having this system in place, even though it was exploitative and not good government. Garfield and the half-breeds wanted to change that. Roscoe Conkling of New York, he was a senator, and the stalwart faction liked things the way they were. Guiteau, in the Swiss cheese of his mind, thought that by assassinating Garfield and thereby elevating Arthur, he was resolving things in favor of the stalwarts. And yes, I know every time I say Garfield, you think of the cartoon cat. So do I. When our current president argues he should be able to fire every government worker who looks at him cross-eyed or isn't a member of his party or doesn't support his agenda and replace them with red hat-wearing cultists, he's trying to reverse some of the protections we've had against that sort of corruption that resulted from this intra-party warfare back in the 1880s and 1890s. The marketing for the show and some of the reviews were very insistent that this president of the United States and this assassin had been totally forgotten by history. And that's probably true if you've only had the minimalist education in history that most of us get. We've only had so many presidents in the approximately 250 years this show has been running. I don't mean mine, I mean the nation's. And every one of them is supposed to be the supreme, the most important, the toppermost of the poppermost, even though a lot of them were mediocrities, or like Garfield, were just short-lived, and their memory can't withstand the onrush of more and more time and more events. Think of all the important things that are now slipping out of living memory just due to the human condition. And you'll know that outside people who have taken the time to read about post-Civil War American politics, most folks won't have heard about this stuff. And if not for our current president reviving some of these issues, you might not have needed to unless, like me, you just have a taste for this stuff, because these were largely solved problems. That said, it would be better if we all had, because the success or failure of the attack depends upon our lack of knowledge of why those structures were in place to begin with. It's kind of like someone saying, well, no one gets milk sick anymore. There are never any germs in milk, so why do we waste all this time and money pasteurizing it anyway? So, in this hypothetical, we stop bothering with pasteurization, 1,000 kids get listeria, a few of them check out at the age of 2 or 3, and all of that was avoidable. But because some nice people took care of that for us in the 19th century, we've had it so good, we forgot why we had it so good. We think that tradition is so strong, but if you think about it, we get the tiniest fraction of the accumulated wisdom of humanity passed down to us. And there are some things that every single generation of humanity probably has to relearn from scratch. I suppose that's one reason that extremely religious people are so defensive about everything and always talking about how they're under attack. Well, they are, not necessarily by temporal opponents, but simply by the march of time, which is temporal in a different sense. That brings me back to Gene Bearden, the rare left-handed knuckleballer. As I said last time, Bearden was a 27-year-old rookie who shocked the league by going 20-7 with a league-leading 2.43 ERA. In the World Series against the Boston Braves, he started Game 3, following future Hall of Fame teammates Bob Feller and Bob Lemon in the rotation. He pitched 9 innings, allowed 5 hits, no walks, struck out 4, and allowed no runs. In Game 6, he came on with the bases loaded and 1 out in the 8th in relief of Lemon. He did allow a couple of inherited runners to score, but Cleveland had a bigger lead than that. He didn't give it up and held on for the save in the 9th. Now, his season turned out to be a one-off, but for a moment he was quite the baseball celebrity. Everyone wanted to meet him and shake his hand. One such person turned up after his victory in Game 3. A 61-year-old man met him in the clubhouse. He pushed his way through the scrum around Bearden and said, "How do, you old rubber arm?" He shook Bearden's hand. "You are a truly wonderful pitcher." and then he left. Who was that? Bearden asked. Bill Killefer, someone said. Who? Bearden asked again. Cleveland owner Bill Veeck thought that Lou Boudreau was kind of dumb, so he surrounded him with some really senior coaches. Among them, Hall of Famers Bill McKechnie and Tris Speaker. And Speaker happened to be standing there. He said, "He's the man who caught Grover Cleveland Alexander," which was to say one of the greatest pitchers in National League history to that point, and in fact to this point. In other words, Killefer knew what he was saying, and if he said you were a good pitcher, that was quite the compliment. Yet, if you didn't know who he was, you would have missed it, as Bearden did. Now, Bill Reindeer Killefer, as ballplayers go, was a common card. He hit .238 with a .273 on-base percentage and a .283 slugging percentage in a little over 1,000 games from 1909 through 1921. And yes, that was the dead ball era, and no, those are not great averages, even after we account for the ball's mucus-like consistency. His career wasn't notably successful in terms of championships. He played in 2 World Series, one with the Phillies, one with the Cubs, and lost to the Red Sox both times. But he was, indeed, Alexander's personal catcher. And when, after the 1917 season, Skinflint Phillies owner William Baker didn't want to pay Alex and traded him to the Cubs for Pickles Dillhofer, Mike Prendergast, and $55,000, Killefer had to go along. He and Alexander, again, arguably the greatest pitcher in NL history, formed the Battery in nearly 300 games. The band only broke up because Killefer retired to manage at 33, and indeed he had a long post-playing career. He managed the Cubs and the Browns, not too successfully in either case. He went into scouting, and the reason he was in Cleveland, in the Cleveland clubhouse, I should say, to meet Bearden after his Game 3 victory was because he worked for the team. Veeck had hired him to scout the Negro Leagues, and in that capacity, Killefer validated Veeck's decision to sign Larry Doby and make him the first black player in the American League. So Bearden didn't know any of that. And as much as I enjoy knowing that and getting to tell you about it, and as much as I hope you enjoy knowing that, I find it hard to fault him for not knowing it. You know, when I was in about the 8th grade, a friend gave me a mixtape. This was his early morning rise and shine, get your pep on, and go seize the day mix. So I was instructed to climb out of bed, slap this thing in the cassette player, and press play. So I did. I went into the bathroom, I got the sink going, I got my razor wetted up, I started shaving at a pretty early age. I pressed play on the little box that I had in there, and the first song began, "Dust in the wind, all we are is dust in the wind." My God, I don't know how I avoided just climbing back into bed for a week. I don't know how I avoided just dragging the razor across my throat. It was like turning on the radio and hearing, "Good morning. I am your morning drive DJ and also your funeral director. We begin with taps, a series of inspiring requiems, and then the greatest hits of D, death, disease, and despair." But you know what? The song is wrong. We aren't dust in the wind. We're ephemera. And you know what? As slight as that is, it's something to aspire to beyond dust. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "2 vast and trunkless legs of stone squatted in the desert, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, catcher of catchers. Look on my stats, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains." The back of the baseball card has long since vanished into the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 353. I am, as ever, Stephen Goldman, your congenial host for this trip to the past. on a mission to understand the present, or better understand it, via the time machine, the vehicle of the national pastime, the game of baseball. And sometimes we talk about other things as well. Last week, I talked about a true crime story, actually, which is almost a parodic thing to say at this point. There's so much of that stuff. Well, while researching this week's stories, I was again distracted by a long-forgotten tale of murder, of a man preying on a woman, this one in New York City. I don't know if I'll tell that story. I'm not doing it this week. And in fact, as I investigated further, I found that another show, another podcast, had taken a shot at it about 6 years ago. And I don't know, that seems like long enough. And there are so many podcasts that I don't know if anyone could have heard them all, and thus it might be new to you anyway, but I'm not inclined to do it. I know that over the course of this show, I have often gone away from the spine, the stem of the game of baseball when it felt like a useful or important or entertaining thing to do, and you guys have been great in following me wherever it is that I did want to go. But I still worry sometimes that I'm pushing it. I didn't get very much feedback at all on the last episode, so I don't know how you felt about that story. It still continues to affect me, the murderer, Buddy. Insofar as I can tell, led a blameless life before and after. But in just one moment, he threw himself away, and in doing so, he threw another child away as well. It feels like it's both uncommon and something that happens with terrible frequency. I'm going to try to keep this interstitial section brief this week. I'm feeling kind of poorly. I hope that none of you have had the misfortune of having radiation applied to either of your eyes. Well, as you know, I have. And one thing that tends to happen is that from then on, your eye, should you get to retain it, and I have. I don't know why at this point, but I have. I mean, I'm hoping against hope to get it back, but it's been a long time now, and if you want to hear something funny, that when this hit me, stem cells were all the rage in medical research. Somehow we hear less about them now. And maybe the reason is what I'm about to tell you, which is, at the same time that I got my diagnosis, the upshot was that, should I live, I was going to lose vision in the afflicted eye, the eye that had cancer. And, well, they said, perhaps stem cells someday will grow you a new optic nerve, pal. Well, they still haven't. And one reason they haven't, well, there are several. One is that the optic nerve is just an incredibly complicated organ, and it's part of your brain. So you really don't want to mess around with it unless you're really sure you know what you're doing. But the other part is, at about the same second they said that to me, the then Bush administration, Bush 2, came out and said, stem cells, they're a horrible affront to God and man. We won't have any more of that around here. And insofar as I know, we haven't. And so they set back the research, maybe permanently, if it ever had any hope at all. And here I am still with a very sick eye, as my doctors like to say. And, well, one thing that happens as a result of taking radiation damage to your peepers, your baby blues, is that they tend to dry out pretty easily. And it's spectacularly painful when they do. And I'm supposed to retard this process by using drops several times a day, but I get lulled into a false sense of security by the summer months when the air conditioning is on and I'm in sort of a moister environment. But once winter comes and the heat turns on, if I don't have a humidifier going, then I really suffer. And, well, I kind of forgot this year, especially today. So as I sit here speaking to you now, it feels like a knight in rusty armor has charged at one of my eyes with a sawtooth lance, and he has rammed that sucker right through and out the back of my head. So if I do sound a little addled today, well, it ain't easy for me just now. I'm in here punching, though, because there are stories to be told, and if you want to hear them, then I want to tell them. It's what I live to do. I also want to tell you, I've meant to do this every year for the last couple of years, and I always just forgot, but I went into Amazon and I dropped the price of paperback copies of the Infinite Inning book, Baseball's Brief Lives, by about 15%, which is all that I can do. There's a formula that they follow, and they say that's the floor. So that book now goes for $12, and I dropped the Kindle price to $7.50. So, if there is someone in your life this holiday season who would enjoy having a book of esoteric baseball stories about esoteric players, then please go buy a copy. I'd be very happy if you did. And not just because I see a little money out of that. And the truth is, even though the book is available outside of Amazon in some circumstances, When someone buys it outside of the Amazon system, and I realize a lot of people have problems with Amazon, I do too at times, I get literally, with the current price, one thin dime. I do a little better, well, a lot better, if you buy it through Amazon. But the real reason I'd love it if people bought more, well, first of all, I just like it when my work is read. But when I look at the lifetime sales, I'm very moved, first of all. It's so touching that someone would want to buy something with my name on the cover. It's a thrill every single time I've been in the position of doing that, whether it's one of my own or a book I've done with Baseball Prospectus. And this one is a little bit of both. We released it on the Baseball Prospectus label, although I'm the only Baseball Prospectus writer in there. But if you're somehow a BP completist, well, this should be part of your collection. But it's neither the money nor ego gratification that I'm after here, but rather that I'd like to do another one. And although over time, people have bought enough of them that I'm both grateful and gratified, I'm not sure that it was enough that it would justify doing a volume 2. I'm going to go halfway to that point because, as you know, those chapters originated in some cases, not every one. There's stuff unique to the book, and every single one of them got revised and expanded. But a number of them appeared as Patreon exclusives for those of you who are generous enough to support the show. And lately, after a kind of fallow period, there are more all the time, more of you, I mean, and I'm so moved and so grateful that you think it's worth helping me continue to do this program, that I want to go back for the first time in a few years and do more of those posts. There are over 100 now, but I'll add to them in the new year. That is my plan. That is my resolution. More infinite inning dead players of the day, as we so tastefully called them. One last note before we move on to Act 2 of the show. I haven't mentioned Afuera Coffee this week. You know, I was paging through an old magazine this week, as I am wont to do. I came across an old ad for Kraft cheese. Isn't it true? When you buy cheese, nothing really matters so much as the certainty that the quality and flavor are going to please you. This was in the 1930s. Kraft cheese will please you. You may be sure of that. If it were not so highly pleasing, it wouldn't be so widely imitated. There's a picture of something with a rind that might be either cheddar or Velveeta, although I'm not sure how Velveeta would come by a rind, and in very small print, a request that you send for their book, Cheese, and ways to serve it. That's almost a Twilight Zone episode, to serve cheese. And then at the very bottom of the page, the slogan, decidedly better. And folks, all I want to tell you about Afuera Coffee this week is that everything that Kraft said about its cheese back in the 1930s applies to their coffee, which is rainforest friendly. And that's the important part. It also drinks well, which is, well, I won't say more important, but almost as important. If you go to afueracoffee.com and use the code Infinite Inning, you will save 15%, the lowest price possible, on Afuera Coffee, and you will find out what I know, which is that it, too, is decidedly better. So tell me, gang, was that ad read cheesy enough for you? I'll say one other thing. I was listening to a number of old radio shows this week just to hear their ad reads, and The Shadow, Who Knows What Evil Lurks in the Hearts of Men, was sponsored by Anthracite, Blue Coal, Pennsylvania Blue Coal. And why was it blue? Because they dyed it blue, so you would know. And I just want to say, I'm pretty sure, well, I know from experience that Afuera does not dye their coffee blue. You can rest assured it looks like coffee. You can also rest assured that I laughed very hard when that ad reader back, over 80 years ago said, this winter, heat your home with healthful coal. Remember a few minutes ago I was talking about pasteurization? We've forgotten why coal wasn't healthy too. Or at least some of us would like to pretend that we have. Okay, time for a break. And on the other side, I want to reflect on an old-time gambling scandal. Actually, that's not true. It wasn't a scandal. It was, oddly enough, a gambling riot, but one where the players kinda came out ahead, thanks to the creative use of, well, a baseball bat. Hang with me, comrades, won't ya? And I'll see you on the other side. Baseball has had many gambling scandals prior to the current pitch-selling case in which the Cleveland closer Emmanuel Clase and starting pitcher Luis Ortiz allegedly tanked certain pitches to facilitate payoffs on prop bets, but only a few in which someone did the right thing. I wrote about one of those people at Baseball Prospectus this week, Phillies shortstop Heine Sand. Sand, as with just about every Phillies player of the 1920s, was of no particular note and wouldn't be remembered at all now. But in 1924, he was approached with a cash offer to lay down for the Phillies' opponent in the second-to-last game of the season. Sand not only strongly demurred, but he went to his manager, who in turn went to Judge Landis, the commissioner. I told that story in full back in episode 13, very early in the show's run, and I also put it out as part of our series of reissue episodes. And by the way, just to validate that last statement about the decade of the 1920s and the Phillies, think about who they had back then. There was center fielder Cy Williams, who was able to hit a lot of home runs in their small ballpark, 2 seasons of Lefty O'Doul, in one of which he hit .398, the beginning of Chuck Klein's career, and a few random pitching seasons. When Hal Carlson put up a .323 ERA in 267 innings in 1926, that was an excellent season given the park, but he wasn't a great pitcher overall. There was also Jimmy Ring and a few others of that nature. The Phillies lost over 100 games 4 times during the decade. They didn't do much better than 90-some losses in most of the other seasons, and the lesson is that if you trade Pete Alexander because you don't want to pay him, the cosmos will smite you. So Sand talked, as he should have talked, and it wasn't just a question of being an upright, moral, law-abiding citizen, but of self-protection. First, because, merely by making him the offer, the crooks had given him guilty knowledge, made him a co-conspirator whether he wanted to be one or not, whether he acted or not. So he was in both baseball and legal jeopardy. Or maybe I should say baseball legal jeopardy and legal jeopardy, which is the situation the 2 Guardians pitchers find themselves in, the end of their baseball careers and the beginning, potentially, of their federal prison careers. And again, I have to emphasize, all of the accusations against them are alleged and they are innocent until proven guilty. And I really, really hope that they are innocent. Second, in Sand's case, while I very much doubt he was thinking about the vitality of the industry in which he worked, he was acting to protect baseball from losing yet more credibility with the public, which in turn could have endangered his job, more than he was endangering it himself by being a 50-error-a-year shortstop, I mean. I don't think there were too many occasions, though, in which baseball players, instead of taking the money, instead of talking up as Sand did, struck back against the gamblers. But it kinda sort of happened once. Would you believe that it involved the Black Sox? No one knew they were the Black Sox yet. They didn't know they were the Black Sox yet. It hadn't happened. It was 1917, and actually, there were subsequently rumors about some games being bought that season as well, and it's very possible they were, but certainly no one had yet committed to tanking a World Series, which the White Sox would actually win at the end of that campaign. Certainly, though, all your favorite John Sayles characters were there for this story. It happened at Fenway Park. It was June 16th. The Red Sox were the defending champions, having beaten the Dodgers or Robins in the World Series the year before. The White Sox, at 34-17 at that point in the season, were leading the Red Sox by 2.5 games and the Yankees by 5. It was a rainy Saturday. The White Sox lineup led off with right fielder Shane Collins, then progressed to, as I said, all your favorites, Buck Weaver, Eddie Collins, Shoeless Joe, Hap Felsch, Chick Gandil, Swede Riesberg, Ray Schalk, and on the mound, Eddie Seacott. Boston's lineup included future Hall of Famer Harry Hooper leading off and playing right field, former $100,000 infielder Jack Barry at second and also managing the club, and Larry Gardner, probably the best third baseman of the early American League. And I should mention the pitcher, a 21-year-old lefty named George Herman Ruth, also called Babe, but occasionally still called Honey as well. Ruth was coming off of a Cy Young Award-type season, finishing with a league-leading 1.75 ERA to go with his 23-12 record. He pitched 9 shutouts and allowed 0 home runs inside or outside the park in 1916. He wasn't quite as good in 1917, his ERA jumping all the way up to 2.01. And I know that sounds ridiculous to say that it was all the way up to an even 2, basically. But first of all, that's what happens when you set a high standard. And the other thing is that in context, it was similar, say, to what Logan Webb or Matthew Boyd did this year. Very good, but not great. Great was Paul Skeens and Tariq Skubal, hence the Cy Young Awards that they just received this past week. Similarly, great that year was, well, Eddie Seacott, whose ERA was 1.53. Over in the National League, Grover Alexander, throwing to Bill Killefer, his ERA led the league at 1.83. The Babe had about the 12th best ERA in the major leagues among qualified pitchers, and today that will make you a very rich man. It was just a step back from what he had done the year before. This game was a contributor to the rise in the Babe's ERA. He wasn't at his best. He was also starting on 2 days rest and on his way to pitching over 300 innings for the second season in a row, so give the old man a break. The young man, I should say. He gave up an RBI double to Jackson in the first, an RBI single to Gandil in the fourth, and an RBI infield hit to Felsch in the sixth. Meanwhile, Seacott had his old team on lockdown. He had them shut out through 7. The Red Sox finally broke through in the bottom of the 8th, getting RBI hits from Gardner and first baseman Dick Hoblitzel. White Sox 3, Red Sox 2 going to the top of the 9th. There was hope for a second, but then Buck Weaver, White Sox third baseman, did something that only about a dozen players before him had done. He hit a ball over the Green Monster, a 2-run shot, and Ruth just broke at that point, allowing 3 consecutive hits, with the last by Felsch again, driving in Collins and Jackson. White Sox 7, Red Sox 2. Seacott got Boston in order in the bottom of the 9th. Ruth made the last out, and that was the final score. But that wasn't the whole story. See, gambling was open in baseball back then, with whole sections in the park almost designated for gamblers. In Fenway Park, it was right field. It was like smoking, non-smoking, gambling, or not gambling. Now they just have betting parlors in the park. Major League Baseball's motto is, addicts are going to be addicted, it's just a fact of life, so we want our taste. There was, as always, money on this game, and that money had agents sitting in the stands trying to will it to pay off. Too bad that it had been bet on the Red Sox. So, when the home team got behind early, the attendance became restive, or at least certain sections did, a subset of the 9,000 and change who were in attendance that afternoon. Were they controlled by the tall man in the raincoat? Sorry, that was lame, but I couldn't help it. There is a tall man in a raincoat. He'll be along in a second. In the 4th inning, it had begun to rain. People in the stands, in the gambling part of the stands, started muttering, then chanting, "Call the game. Call the game?" The Boston Globe said the "call the game" chant steadily grew in volume until, when the White Sox came to bat in the 5th, it seemed as if every man in the bleachers was shouting. They wanted the game stopped, the beat writers intuited, before the score counted, because then they could still get rain checks, but also because they could get their money back from the bookies. The sky darkened and it began raining harder. The attendees in the center field bleachers sought shelter by crowding into the section behind first base, which was covered by the grandstand. They got there by walking across the field while the game was still in progress. There were about 5 cops on hand, not enough to stop all of this from happening, and whereas today at most ballparks, if you try to move up a seat class, the ushers will try to break your legs. Whoever the Red Sox had working the park that day, and this was under Harry Frazee, they made no effort to stop center field from moving to first base, Burnham Wood from moving to Dunsinane Hill, and that sort of thing. The chanting continued as the rain fell. Now it was all focused in the first base seats. The umpires did not listen, and so with 2 outs in the top of the 5th, about 300 attendees just took matters into their own hands, climbing the railing and swarming the field. "Call the game!" The Chicago Tribune said the rioters were spurred on by some tall fan in a long raincoat. Now, who that evil mastermind was, I do not know, because he wasn't the one who got in trouble that day. Would you believe it was a couple of the White Sox? And I will tell you that story and conclude this week's episode right after this brief intermission. At the point that the fans charged the field, the game was paused because it had to be paused. The rioters weren't violent at first, but were content to just trespass and block up the diamond. Retro Sheet's play-by-play for the game says there was a 30-minute rain delay, and there was a rain delay subsequently. But really, at first, it was the police coming in with the Mounties and shutting down this wannabe riot. By the time they got that done, it really had been raining too hard to continue, so they took a further time out. After 30 or 45 minutes, depending on the account, Boston's groundskeepers, which at that time was probably more like groundskeeper singular, dumped a whole lot of sawdust on the field, and the umpires said, "Play ball." All the writers, whether they were from Boston or Chicago, said that the field really should have been declared unplayable at that point, and the game stopped, but for whatever reason, the umpires just weren't going to be persuaded. And as I've already told you, the game did go the full 9. The White Sox argued that the game should be forfeited to them once the fans had swarmed the field, which was not an unreasonable argument. And indeed, after, even Harry Frazee said, yeah, you should have done that. The umpires were just really motivated to make this a legal game. The Chicago Herald strongly implied the umpires were trying to let Frazee keep his gate, but that seems sort of unlikely. And the funny part is how misguided the rioters were. In fact, when they were milling about the field and refusing to leave, Jack Barry, again the Red Sox second baseman and manager, had to explain to them, look, if you don't go, the umpires are going to forfeit the game to the White Sox. That means that those of you who bet on us to win will lose your stake. What don't you understand about this? And they did. They finally got it. So they said, oh. And they wandered back off the field. Most of them. There was some violence. A few of the fans and one of the cops, with some provocation, went after the White Sox. As Chicago's players left the field via the Red Sox dugout, during the swarming, and then the rain delay, someone sculled Buck Weaver with a bottle, and someone else, supposedly a sailor, although he doesn't figure in the rest of the story, punched Buck in the jaw. He hadn't even hit the big home run yet. That was still in the future. Simultaneously, White Sox catcher Ray Schock turned to the head of the police brigade that was at the park and said something to the effect of, "Why don't you go fix this? What are you, a coward?" And that officer said something to the effect of, "Oh, a coward am I?" and was narrowly prevented from doing a tap dance on Ray Schock's face. Chief O'Hara was much more relaxed after his later transfer to Gotham City. You'd think it would be the opposite, but no, Gotham City is much easier to police than Boston. The roads are more rational. And although it sounds like Buck Weaver got the worst of it, after the game, one Augustine J. McNally of Norwood, Massachusetts, alleged that he had been assaulted by Weaver and utility infielder Fred McMullen. It may seem odd that one can be assaulted while illegally trespassing and possibly threatening a professional ball player, but I suppose you can be. You have to imagine the scene. It was kind of chaos. Under the stands and in the clubhouses, there was a terrific wrangle of players, umpires, club owners, and police officers, wrote the Chicago Tribune, the writer apparently accepting himself, whereas McNally, the Trib said, was one of the mob which attempted to break up the game Saturday, and during the fussing is supposed to have bumped McMullen's fist with his eye. Also, he is supposed to have had his fingers on the railing just when Weaver let his bat fall. Boy, Buck Weaver sure showed great eye-hand coordination throughout that game, didn't he? 2 big hits for him, one over the Green Monster, one over Augustine J. McNally. McNally got no satisfaction, Both players pled not guilty, and the charges were dismissed in September when the complainant failed to show up for his own case. Weaver and McMullen were totally out of the woods forever, just kidding. As for Augustine, I don't know how the rest of his life went, except that he was a milkman with 5 children, and he was 36 years old at the time, old enough to have known better than to be getting into fistfights with 2 ball players who were both in their mid-20s, and at least one of whom was armed with a big wooden stick. Maybe he'd been drinking. Maybe he'd been gambling. Maybe both. Would you believe he outlived both Buck Weaver and Fred McMullen? Living outside the law isn't healthful, and given that Milkman Gus seems to have finished his trip to the ballpark with broken fingers, gambling on a rainy day between the White Sox and the Red Sox isn't too good for you either, especially back then when you really didn't know whether the game was on the up and up. Americans of the time just had to hope and acted in ignorance of the reality that some of these ball games were cooked. That's yet another thing we've forgotten, why we put the institutional rails in place to prevent that from happening, and that is, in part, what the ongoing suspensions and possible prosecutions of Clase and Ortiz is about. The foregoing isn't simply a screed against gambling. As with any vice, gambling can be fine if indulged in moderation. It's also not as fun as it would be if the gambler in question hadn't been Gus the milkman who got creamed by a bat, but Sport Sullivan or one of the other dogs who were bent on bilking the public. It's just a wish that these 2 relative children with the guardians hadn't done something so dumb. Maybe the gamblers had something on them, I don't know, but either way, I wish that when they'd been approached, they did what Buck Weaver did and picked up a bat. And failing that, they could have been more like Heine Sand and simply talked. No, wait, on second thought, I take that back. Buck Weaver's approach would have been the better course of action. Pick up the bat. How often in the last 106 years have we been able to say Buck Weaver had it right? If only he had been consistent in his approach in 1919 with what he had done in 1917. When it comes to gamblers, don't stop, don't think, just... I mean, what's a simple assault charge compared to being banned from baseball for forever? Should you wish to talk to me forever, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social, and you can write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Search on Infinite Inning. Bang, you're there. Say what you want to say, do what you want to do, go where you want to go. That's a song, isn't it? Should you wish to support the show, and so many of you have, again, thank you. Please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. And on that note, I would like to thank the latest to join up, Todd and Jason. Thank you so much, fellas. You, like all other subscribers, will get new posts in the new year, as I promised earlier. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice, if podcatchers are still a thing, and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, just be really careful who's lurking around when you put your fingers on the railing. Could be a fellow holding a bat. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who at the conclusion of this episode turns to Statler and together they chant, "Call the show! Call the show!" Well, if the cat who rides cows isn't deceived by a piebald hippo and decides to bring him home to try out the hot tub, resulting in my snood collection being flooded out, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.